Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis-a-Famille History Podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with Dr. Audra Diptee, who is our Associate Professor, Africa and the Caribbean, Slavery, Race Relations at Carleton University. In 2011, the British policy called Operation Legacy became public knowledge. It was a covert and an elaborate policy implemented in at least 37 former British colonies between the 1950s and the 1970s. Its objective was to destroy colonial documents, clandestinely remove others back to Britain, and to even alter some documents that were left behind in those colonies which were on the verge of attaining political independence. It also involved developing a parallel filing system so that the incoming political leadership remained unaware that any documents were missing. We will be discussing the British policy called Operation Legacy and its impact in the Caribbean. So let's have a listen.
So I just wanted to thank you so much, Professor Diptee, for coming on to the podcast, Dis-a-Famille History, to talk about Operation Legacy. So, and I'm looking really forward to having the discussion with you because this is so impactful in terms of researching, whether it's your family tree or just generally as to what that means for within the British Atlantic. All right, I'll just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for having me. So I am a history professor. I am from the Caribbean, but I teach in Ottawa, Canada at Carleton University. And I specialize in Caribbean history, so that should be no surprise. And what should I say? I would probably say that my earlier project dealt with the Atlantic slave trade, specifically to Jamaica, looking at the connections between West and West Central Africa and Jamaica and the way in which that influenced women and children in particular, but not exclusively. And my current project is on a 20th century project on Operation Legacy. And I'm really eager to have this opportunity to chat with you about that one.
No, thank you so much for that. And I'm looking forward to this discussion since it is very impactful. So again, would you be able to tell us as to what explain what exactly is Operation Legacy and how it was implemented in the British colonies, especially in Jamaica?
Okay. So Operation Legacy was a policy put in place, imposed by Britain between the 1950s and the 1970s throughout all of its colonies. But it was staggered. It didn't happen at the same time for all the colonies. It happened just before each colony was about to attain political independence. And there's a reason for that. The motivation behind the point of the policy, the objective of the policy was to either remove or destroy, secretly remove or destroy colonial documents just before each colony got independence. So in other words, when the new incoming government, which would be arguably the first Prime Minister of Jamaica, the first Prime Minister of Trinidad, the first Prime Minister of Barbados, whenever they were coming in power, they would be missing a significant number of files. But here's the ticker. They wouldn't know. They weren't supposed to know it was missing. It's not like they said, these are our documents. We're going to destroy it and remove it. They actually covered their tracks. They actually created documents that hid, to mislead. They had a double filing system to mislead people. So they didn't know that documents were missing. And this was imposed throughout most colonies, if not all, between the 50s and 70s. But in the Caribbean in particular, of course, is what we're interested in. There's just one more thing I wanted to say, that even though it was started in 50s and 70s, that's when the term was coined. Operation Legacy. But the practice of destroying documents existed before that. So we know, for example, in India, they destroyed documents in the 1940s when India became independent, willy-nilly. But the difference is that they did not have a policy. So they made their mistakes, quote unquote, in India. They're like, oh, we just destroyed documents. We just burnt them. Now we need a policy in place. And we have these documents outlining what that policy is. And it was circulated from one corner of the British, from one British colony to another. So we have it from Kenya and Ghana to, all the way to the Caribbean, et cetera, et cetera.
I guess the stated reasons that the British government enacted Operation Legacy.
Well, according to the documents that were circulated from colony to colony, and they were pretty standard, more or less, they had four listed reasons that was repeated over and over again. The first one was that any document that might embarrass Her Majesty's government, right? So there are essentially 4 criteria. And by the way, this is when they're choosing these documents, we're going to figure out what documents we don't want them to see, phase 1. And phase 2 is then we figure out if we're going to burn them or sink them in the bottom of the Caribbean Ocean, or if we're going to take them away and hide them back in England, right? Those were the 2 options. So if they called this sifting the documents, right? That's the language they use. So when they were going through the process of sifting the documents, the criteria for the removal of documents was if it would embarrass Her Majesty's government, right? So embarrass the British government. 2, embarrass members of the police, the military force, public servants, etc., or their informants. If it would compromise intelligence sources. And 3, and this is where it's you have to read this 4, this last one a little bit critically, where they said it could be used unethically by ministers in the successor government. So unethically, of course, is going to be determined by Britain, right? By the colonial office. So whatever they determined was unethical. So they're saying if these records could be used, quote unquote, unethically by the incoming government, then we have to remove it. Now, unethical could be morally unethical, or could it just be them behaving in a way that didn't, that was not aligned with British interests, economic interests? Like, who knows how they were going to define unethical? So those were the 4 that got listed over and over again. And like I said, they were either burnt, the permission was given burning was very, very labor intensive. And on these islands, you'd have lots of smoke and all of this. So the permission was given to drop them in quote unquote weighted crates in current free water if burning was going to be a problem. Yeah.
That is really severe in terms of how they were really going to remove.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. And I guess what this hints at is the degree to which they were thinking about, organized. This was not just unplanned, they did all the unplanned stuff before. So by the time they got to Operation Legacy, they were like, okay, we're going to put a system in place. But I have to say, it wasn't always effective in executing the system, but this was the idea they had, what they wanted to do to get rid of these documents.
Well, they really used a lot of their power to be able to do so. So, with this destruction of the documents and or the removal, how did it affect Jamaica's ability to document their colonial history?
Well, of the files that have been remaining, and I just want to maybe give a little bit of background to Operation Legacy. So we didn't know about Operation Legacy for years. That Britain was denying that there were the files that they had taken. They denied. So I think it's about 2010, 2011, we finally learned about Operation Legacy. Right? So not that long ago. And so once we learned about it, we found out that they were hiding these documents in a secret archive in a place called Hanslope Park, which is a couple 100 kilometers, I think, north of London, perhaps. And so it came out because of a court case regarding some human rights abuses in Kenya. So once the government was forced to admit that they had these documents, it was at that point, and it took a couple years, 2 or 3 years, for them to put it in the National Archives in London. So it's in Kew Gardens in London right now. All these files are in Kew Gardens in London. So we now know there are about 1,000 files, just shy of 1,000 files for the region, for the Caribbean. And I have to say, that doesn't, I don't know how that sounds to listeners or to viewers, if that sounds like a lot or it sounds like a little, but each of those files many of those files has hundreds and hundreds of pages. So it's not a file with 2 pages. Some of them have 300-400 pages. So, they can be, it's quite a lot of information to go through. That said, we don't know what was destroyed. So we do not know what we lost. Okay, so we're just trying to put together the pieces with an incomplete puzzle. But that's what historians do all the time anyway. So in the case of Jamaica, to answer your question, what does this have to do? How does this influence the way in which Jamaica's story was written? It complicates the Jamaica narrative in a lot of ways. For starters, we know that of the files that are left, there are about over 300 specific to Jamaica out of the just shy of 1,000. And many of them are around Jamaican independence, right? So going into the 60s and just post-independence of it. So it's going to, and I'm working through these right now for Jamaica, and not just Jamaica, but also with regards to Trinidad, with regard to the West Indian Federation that existed between 1958 and 1962, etc. It is going to help us rewrite or recontextualize or offer a new interpretation of independence for the region, for the individual nations, etc. That's where I suspect a lot of the we're going to find a richness of data, and I don't know if it will be absolutely mind-blowing or if it's going to reinforce our suspicions, because historians and politicians from that period have always been saying things. They're working against us. Britain is working against us, right? So it might just reinforce what we already know, in the same way that, for example, with Operation Legacy, if I were to just walk in, meet somebody on the street and say, they've just been telling us a particular historical story that, makes Britain look good, everybody like, yeah, tell me something I don't know. Who knew they had a policy? I mean, it's the policy that's shocking, right? Not the fact that they tell history from a British perspective. So I feel like in many ways, this might either blow our minds with new information or give us real evidence to reinforce things we strongly suspected as Caribbean people.
Definitely. And it's just to know the amounts. I know that you said it's 1,000 documents, but again, when you go to Kew office, you can have multiple things in those documents, in terms of what could be taken or destroyed under that policy, which is it just has your mind going as to what could potentially be. So again, with that destruction, how would it, helped or shape the policies of post-independence for government policies in Jamaica?
There's a very interesting quote that I found in one of the records with specific reference to Jamaica. So just as they were imposing Operation Legacy, instructions came from the Colonial Office, and it said, sift, right? So in other words, go through, sift all the records to ensure that none are left which should not be seen by the government of an independent Jamaica, right? So they made sure, go through these We want to make sure that none are left, that we don't want the government of an independent Jamaica to see. This is at the same point in time where, if you look at the media at this time, you have Princess Margaret in Jamaica coming down to Jamaica and saying, oh, we're going to remain friends in the post-independent period. We're going to be, and at the same time, more or less, they're saying, let's destroy as many of these documents as possible. When you line these two things up, one against the other, you juxtaposition them, you start to think, oh my gosh, this is, smiling on the one side with one face and then, having ulterior motives on the other, or having a plan behind the scene. So its impact on policies in particular, well, it's hard to say, but we do have some examples. If you think about, for example, one of the arguments I make, and as I work through these documents, it's linked to a larger project called Chained in Paradise: How History Was Used to Change the Future. And it looks specifically at the way in which power was used to influence the way in which Caribbean people understand their past and their present and their future, right? But if we think about Operation Legacy and its impact on post-independence, and we reflect on, for example, the 1972 election with Michael Manley, right? Michael Manley came in on a platform of democratic socialism. One of the arguments I make in my book, Chained in Paradise, is that while Caribbean people got political independence, the goal was never by Britain to give them sovereignty, meaning we will give you all the symbols of independence, right? And I'm focusing on Britain here, but the U.S. is also implicated, right? So we will give you all the symbols of independence. We will tell you that you are politically independent. You will have elections. You will do all those things. But we do not want that power dynamic between Britain and the Caribbean to change. So this is where we go from colonialism to what they call neo-colonialism. In other words, we're going to keep the same power dynamic. So we've made a change officially. You are politically independent, but you are not sovereign. You still have to dance for us, and your economies still have to serve our interests, right? And so the best example of this is, I think, and not the best, but a really good example is Michael Manley and his attempts at democratic socialism, in which it was severely undermined by the U.S. with the support of Britain. So, and the reasons behind it failing was because they wouldn't support. This was an independent nation, but it did not have the sovereignty, and so Michael Manley was undermined each step of the way by the World Bank, the IMF, and all these institutions are controlled by who, right? So, not by Jamaicans, or people in the Caribbean. So, yeah, so to answer your question, I would say, how did Operation Legacy impact post-independence governance policies? I think Michael Manley didn't need to know about Operation Legacy, quite frankly, because he already knew it. What this tells us, though, is that now, as we go through these documents, we will have the kind of evidence to tell us what we strongly suspected. You know what I mean? It will give us real data around what we strongly suspected. It might reinforce. And like I said, as I go through these documents, I will not be surprised if I find things that surprise me. But I'm really certain it's going to reinforce things that we intuitively know, but have been denied access to that data.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, anytime you're trying to hide something, it definitely is trying to imply. And I know for myself, I come across records that I never thought I would ever see in the archives, but it's just I can only imagine what was actually then destroyed, because, I mean, if what I've seen is just, so impactful, the others must be even more so. And to kind of, not have that. And as you said, it was more or less a surface level government, so to speak, in terms of their independence. So Legacy kind of impacted the broader understanding of British colonial rule in the Caribbean.
Yeah. So, in the Caribbean, we've done a good job in recent decades. I want to give Jack his jacket, right?
Mhm.
We've done a good job of trying to make Caribbean people aware. When and there was an earlier generation in the 1950s and maybe even in the 1960s. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
In the 1950s and maybe even in the 1960s that were based in the Caribbean, were taught British history, right? They knew British history, British geography, etc., but not, And so we've done a good job of making sure that young people have Caribbean-centered perspectives, assuming they do history. So, that is great. And that's important. That said, we're facing another kind of challenge, in my opinion. And the challenge really is that, and again, let me just go back for a second. During the 60s and the 50s and in the 40s, even 1940s, Caribbean people, our activists, our artists, our politicians, our intellectuals, were always arguing for a Caribbean perspective. We need to have Caribbean art. We need to have things that reflect our experiences,
Yes.
right? So so that we can understand the world from our positionality. And so right now, I feel that we've lost a lot of that. We've lost a lot of that because we have access. For example, the average person in the Caribbean now has access to television. With many of them have cable, and it's, what is it, 200 channels with the majority on the US and a smattering from Canada and the UK, I imagine. And so when you have people watching these kind of programming, that's not a Caribbean centered narrative. When you have people watching Fox News or what have you, that is not a Caribbean centered narrative. And you have much easier access to foreign news than you do to local news. So I don't know if you have easier access, but you certainly have more. You are inundated with that.
Mhm.
And then we're talking about social media and we're talking about all these other things, right?
Mhm.
Now, believe it or not, during the colonial period, in the fifth Operation Legacy talks about this. They were very, very concerned about what Caribbean people listened to, and in terms of the radio and what they read and what they saw in the cinema. So to show you the extent to which they were concerned with the Caribbean imagination and keeping the Caribbean imagination colonized, right? Or trying their best to do that as much as possible, is that they talked about the way in which they would censor certain programs. They were very concerned about the fact that the Americans had radio programs that Caribbean people had access to. They're like, we can't have them listening to too much. The Americans are closer than we are, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a actual competition between the US and Britain for colonizing the Caribbean mind and for influencing the way we think. Right? And so in many ways, this is what Operation Legacy was about. This was about trying to colonize, put limits on the way in which Caribbean people understood their past, their reality, their selves, and we've had radical intellectuals who saw past all of that. But if they could get the majority of us to see in a particular way, the battle became that much harder.
No, definitely. Just to kind of change the narrative and change who has influence, right? So I guess, were there any gaps in the historical record that still exist because of this policy? Is that known?
Well, we're working through it, right? We're working through it. I would say for sure has to do with the West Indian Federation. So the West Indian Federation, they have like at least 200, approximately 220 files specific to the West Indian Federation. And so that Federation, for those listeners or viewers who might not be familiar with what the West Indian Federation was, it was an attempt for the region in the British Caribbean to attain its political independence as a region, as opposed to Jamaica will be independent, Trinidad will be independent, Barbados. So let's get our independence and we will call ourselves the West Indies nation, right? And we'll be under one flag. We'll have, that, because together, united we stand, divided we fall, right? So if we stand united as a region, arguably, we will be able to better defend ourselves in this globalized world against our former colonizers, et cetera, et cetera. That federation didn't last very long. And in those documents, and historians have dealt with this a bit, but that the way the federation documents were written, the way it was organized, it wasn't meant to give the people of the West Indies, under this West Indian nation, much power. The power was still going to stay with Britain. It was going to, in terms of finances as well, was still going to be controlled. Their purse strings was going to be controlled by Britain, etc. So it fell apart. And I think when going through those documents might give us even more insight into the way that West Indies Federation was undermined from the start. Because, that was a moment of hope, but also a moment of despair when it collapsed for people of a particular generation.
Wow, it's just so impactful just to take away documentation and what that would mean. So, and what has your research been able to reconstruct of the lost history using alternative sources?
I have been trying to, again, because this was so much about the Caribbean imagination, right? So I am very, as a historian, I get quite frustrated when people question the value of history, because the majority of people think history is about dates and details and facts and that kind of thing. And that is not what it's about, right? Those are necessary. It's necessary data that we have to use, but history is about interpreting the past, right? And so, as we see with Operation Legacy, or as I intend to argue in my book Chained in Paradise with Operation Legacy, this was an attempt to colonize, to limit, to keep Caribbean people, or to keep people throughout in all British colonies unaware of what Britain was really doing to them, to keep them miseducated. To quote C.L.R. James, it was to miseducate people in the region. That was the goal. It wasn't to educate, it was to miseducate. And so if this was about colonizing the imagination, then, I'm really interested in looking at poetry and songs and calypsos and reggae, for example, and the ways in which what that tells us about people, how people understood their world in that period. That I have a former student of mine who did a website. I'll give it a shout out. It's Steve Talbot, and he worked on Michael Manley, the 1972 election, and he looked at the power of reggae during that election and what that said, and how Max Romeo called himself a declared Manleyite, and so the way in which he used reggae to support Manley, to persuade, but he also used it to critique Manley. He also critiqued Manley when necessary, and he also used reggae to educate the public when he had his 1974 song. I think it's called "Socialism is Love." To let people know that this is what Manley's trying to do. Let me give you an alternative narrative to what socialism is, because 1972, this is also during the Cold War. So socialism is taboo in a big way. So he's articulating ideas to Caribbean people in a way that to Jamaican people in a way that Jamaicans could understand, using a vocabulary and a genre that is comprehensible to everyday Jamaicans, so that they can be easily persuaded. And so it is, for me, it would be looking through art forms, for example, but and that's one way. And then, of course, we there are other more traditional ways. You have to go look at, sources in the US, CIA sources, etc., for example, that will help reveal, fill in some of the blanks for us.
Yeah, no, definitely. And do you as well have your own website where you have some of these documentations on for people to view?
So I've launched a website, but it's a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
If viewers or listeners would like to know more about what I'm finding, I do have a newsletter and where I do sneak peeks, which would be they might be interested in knowing about, and it's at chainedinparadise.com. chainedinparadise.com, and and I give out little tidbits on what I found and that kind of thing. Yeah. So.
Oh, that's perfect. I'll put that in the show notes. So if anyone wants to click on that, they can be able to look and be able to find that information. So with Operation Legacy, what did it reveal really about Britain's efforts to manage its image as a colonial power?
I read a really interesting quote somewhere, and I don't recall where I read it, but I repeat this quote all the time. And it went something like this. Anybody that's in doubt of the utility of history or its usefulness, they just need to ask themselves why, whenever a dictator comes into power, the first thing they do is they rewrite the history books.
Yeah.
Right? And so this is what this was an attempt to prevent Caribbean people from rewriting a history that made sense of their world.
Yes.
In a way that made sense of their world to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Where they were the actors, they were the agents in their own story, where they were looking out instead of taking that British perspective. They were recognizing their injustices. They had, they could rewrite that narrative. And so that's what this is about in many ways. And that was the great concern of Britain. It was, and also it was not just about this fight over the past, just because, oh my gosh, we're really concerned that they're going to think we were horrible. We were horrible in the past. This was also because there is a link between how we understand the past and how we perceive our present and how we imagine our future. So if people of the Caribbean believe that Britain saved them and civilized them, then they're going to always go to Britain and say, hey, can you help us solve our problems? You're more developed than we are. You're more advanced than we are, without understanding that there is a power dynamic and that Britain, and even I have to say it, the United States, they are serving their own interests. The way in which Caribbean colonies were organized, Hilary Beckles says it. Eric Williams in Capitalism and Slavery, 1944, says it in his book, that these colonies were organized to enrich the colonizer economically, right? Of course, there was slavery and exploitation, but all of that was for a reason. And the reason was to leave nothing in the region and to take as much out and send it back to Britain. And so the goal during the period of, we're going to call it political independence, or we can call it during the period of neocolonialism, the goal during that period was to make sure that Britain could still extract, these foreign powers could still extract as much power as possible, as much resources as possible. Mm-hmm. The easiest way to do that, though, is to convince people from the region that no harm is being done and they are really there to help. They're really here to help. They're here to save Caribbean people from themselves.
Yes, the savior. Should the British government take responsibility for the loss of these historical records in Jamaica and, of course, in the Caribbean due to Operation Legacy?
Well, yeah, and they would argue that they have, because they've revealed the documents are now in the archive. Technically, anyone can access them. The problem, of course, is if you're a historian and you're from the Caribbean, you have to get to England, right? And that's expensive. Accessing them is not that easy. I think there's a limit of about 14 documents per day. You have to order them a week in advance. It takes a lot of planning. You're going to have to be there for a while. These documents are several hundred pages long, many of them. So although they are accessible, they're not really accessible. You cannot practically access them if you're from the region. Even myself, I'm from Canada. I have to think twice about how I'm going to get to them. So they would say that they do take responsibility. I'm sure I don't know. I can't recall if they've formally apologized, but they have acknowledged that these documents that these documents were hidden. But I don't know how other people feel. But they only did so when they were forced to, right? They only did so when they were denying it up until the last minute. So, take that for what it's worth.
No, definitely. And then, of course, how can Jamaica and these other colonies, address the gaps in their historical narratives caused by Operation Legacy?
So, here's one of my frustrations with Caribbean history right now. Operation Legacy deals largely with the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Now, we have as somebody who specialized in slavery, when I was, and spent a good part of my career working on the Atlantic slave trade, and I understand it, and it is horrific, and it is a, really significant part of the Caribbean past. My frustration with Caribbean history is that while we talk about slavery so much, there have been a series of other injustices. I'm laughing, but it's not. I'm laughing, and but there have been a series of other injustices that have taken place after that we don't think about. That and we don't. Historians know about them, but the general public, and so those things don't get the kind of attention. Like, there are injustices that are more recent that also need to be, that remind us, that show us, that reinforce that this power dynamic still exists, that we are still, and so for me, the real reason why, or one of the many reasons that I'm very interested in Operation Legacy, is because I'm interested in uncovering or emphasizing or better understanding the kinds of injustices that took place after, the 18th and 19th centuries. I really do want to understand that, the way in which they undermined our sovereignty, our right to be politically independent and take care of our own people, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things that, also deserve attention and help, and also do a large part to explain some of the problems we have today in the region.
Yeah, definitely. And then I guess that would be then part of the lessons. What can be learned from Operation Legacy about the importance of preserving historical records during times of political transition?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, what role then can you say about education and public awareness? Well, how would that play in addressing the historical erasure caused by this policy?
As an educator, somebody who, that teaches history, and one of the things I'm very interested in is in teaching students about the uses of history. So I'm much less interested in teaching students about, they need to know this stuff. They need to understand when certain things happen. When did Christopher Columbus come? He came before the slaves were emancipated in 1838. That kind of thing. We need them to understand certain things, and chronology and methodologies and that kind of thing. What I feel as educators we do not do a good enough job of is teaching students to understand that history is used. It is a tool. It can be weaponized. I actually, if you see my coffee mug here,
Yes,
it's usable history. And it is to remind students that history is a tool that can be used against us, that we can use for ourselves. History has been weaponized And it is not this benign thing where we sit there and say, well, why do we need to study history anyway? Because if we do not, people are going to create stories that disempower us. And we need to have the tools necessary to create the right kind of historical stories, one. And two, we have to know how to do it. It's not just willy-nilly. Historians have a toolbox that they work with. And there's good history and bad history. And what determines good history and bad history is whether or not the person that has written the historical narrative, constructed that story, is well informed and stays loyal, has a high level of fidelity to historical methodology. Meaning, do they really look at their sources with a critical eye? Do they, all sorts of things, all the tools that and methodologies that historians need to incorporate. And that, for me, is where I think Operation Legacy is a spectacular example of how an attempt to deny Caribbean people the right to understand their past. And we could just tell the story of Operation Legacy, but just as important, I think, or more important, is to remind students that what Operation Legacy really hints at is that history is something that has been weaponized by powerful countries against people in the region. And we need to understand the methodologies of historians so we can fight back.
No, definitely, I agree. And finally, Professor, how does Operation Legacy now influence, the current debates about colonial reparations and justice for former colonies like Jamaica and in the Caribbean region?
I would say it expands the argument around reparations because, again, it makes us aware. And I'm sure all the people that are doing good work on reparations are aware of this, but it allows us to expand that and to show the degrees to which injustices were committed way up until the 20th century and even now, right? Other future historians can be writing about what happened now. So that, to me, is the real key here about the way in which it's going to affect reparations. It's going to say this was, yes, human rights abuses were committed and crimes against humanity were committed and all those things. But, the systematic attempt to underdevelop, to use Walter Rodney's terms, the region continued. And, so reparations was not just for the colonial period. They worked hard to make sure that this continued well into the national period, well into the neo-colonial period. So, there are what Operation Legacy does, and I argue this, and I intend to argue this, or I'm working through these ideas in the book Chained in Paradise, is it leaves us with three things. The first is that power influences history and how we remember the past. The people with power can influence our ideas of the past. And when they influence how we imagine the past, they influence how we understand the present and how we imagine the future. That means they have the capacity to limit, to colonize our minds, to colonize our present, to colonize our future, if they set parameters around how we understand our world. The more optimistic side of that, which I'll also be addressing in the book, is that people from the Caribbean have used history as a tool to fight back, right? So point one, history was weaponized. Point two, people from the region always understood that history was a tool for social justice. None of them from the anti-colonials ever thought, oh my God, what am I going to do with history? They are turning in their graves every time they hear somebody from the Caribbean say something like that. They were historians and they understood we need access to our documents to write our own stories, to fight back. They have used history against us. We need to write histories that will prove, that will demonstrate that we have been subject to high levels of injustice. And they also understand, and this is the third point, is that ideas of the past influence our future. And so, we have an obligation to fight for the right narratives, right Caribbean-centered narratives. And we're not always going to agree with them, all Caribbean people, but that's the beauty of it. Like, we get to participate in debates which bring her arguably to a better understanding, better historical interpretations that will hopefully lead us to higher ground.
No, thank you so much, Professor Diptee, for coming on to the podcast and speaking about Operation Legacy, because it is extremely important and very vital, just as you indicated. Because, I mean, what is the past definitely shapes our future for sure. So, again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.